You know, uh, I found the problem with the transaction management. You know, as I said, the issue is very small. It's a very small issue, but uh, I had a bad time dealing with it because I didn't concentrate much on a particular line here in the code, which was actually, avoiding uh, replying the advice, transaction advice. Okay, I'll tell you what is it. So we had the add product method, right? So you will find in the method actually in order to add the product record, I'm calling the save method. Alright? I'm calling the save method. Yes. So the thing is here the save method it adds the product record to the database, and you see in order to call the save method again I'm using a session, right? So the way we are obtaining the session here is the problem. The way we are obtaining the session here is a problem. Everything else is fine. The only thing is this line, the way we were trying to obtain the session was causing the issue here. Okay. So, instead of using this open session, what we have to do is we have to obtain the session using a method called as get current session. You have to use this method called as get current session. Okay, this will fix the issue. Yeah, let's do this. Now we'll try to insert the record. Okay, so here I'll delete few records. Just a second, please. Okay. I've deleted few records here. Now you got only 4 records here, right? We got 4 records here. Here, we'll try to add a record using this application. As of now, we are trying to apply this transaction advice here. So where is this code defined? How we are configuring the advice code? So for that, we are using the configuration file, right? In the configuration file, we have configured. So we are using XML stuff here. Okay, here if it is point cut expression, it refers to that method, to which method you want to apply the advice. So the details are provided here. Okay, yes. Now we'll run this code. So you see here, in this case, you'll find that we got a form for this. Yeah. See, I'll try to insert the record with the for node 7. Okay. So click on add. You see, insert query is generated here by the Hibernate, and you should find the record here. Yes, the record is added. So instead of using the open session method to obtain the session object, we have to use get current session. We have to use get current session. So now you might be thinking, what's the difference between these two methods? Okay, what if I obtain the session using open session method, and what if I obtain the session using get current session? Yes, definitely there is a lot of difference. I'll tell you what. Actually, here you know that in this case the transaction advice is applied by the Spring framework, right? Transaction advice is applied by the Spring framework. Okay, yes. So here you will find that generally, if you let's forget about this for a while, and let's say if you want to apply the advice, if you want to handle the transaction, generally what you will do, if you want to handle the transaction, generally what you will do, yes, if you want to explicitly handle the transaction, then what you will do, forget about the the support which is provided by the framework for handling the transactions. If you are supposed to manually handle the transaction, then what you have to do here, so first of all, what you need, if you want to deal or if you want to handle the transactions explicitly, okay, on your own, in Hibernate, generally what you will do, yes, in Hibernate what you will do, you will obtain a transaction object. You have to know, in Hibernate, I'm talking about in general, if you want to deal with the transactions, okay, if you're supposed to handle the transactions on your own, what you're supposed to do, first of all, you have to obtain a transaction object from the session. You know, in Hibernate, if you want to obtain the session, there is no other option for you except using the session object. Through the session object itself, the transaction object can be obtained, and you have to obtain the session object using that method get transaction or use this begin transaction method. Any one of the method is fine. So here, and you see what are all the modifications or changes which you do using the session object. Whatever the changes or modifications you do using the session object here, those changes will be updated, okay, accordingly by the transaction. Okay, so we are using the transaction object, right? Always the transaction and session objects are linked. Okay, so what are all the changes which you have done, they will be synced, they will be updated here to the database. Yes, through the commit method. When you call the commit method, you know what happens basically. So which is in the transaction. So you know, even the Spring framework, okay, the AOP or advice bean, we got a predefined advice, right? What is that advice? Predefined advice class name, transaction interceptor. Now let's talk about this advice bean class called as transaction interceptor. Now in this case, if you want to apply the advice, in this case, if you want to apply the advice, then okay, so what you will do? Yes, you see, I'm sorry, instead of we handling the advice, transaction advice, here the transaction interceptor will do this. But you know, the transaction interceptor also has to follow the same steps. First of all, you know, in order to manage the transaction interceptor also needs a transaction object. Okay, that means here in order to obtain the transaction object, first of all, which object is needed? In order to obtain the transaction object, first of all, which object is needed? Yes. In order to obtain the transaction object, first of all, which object is needed? Yes. The transaction interceptor, it has to obtain which object? Very good. It needs a session, first of all. And, you know, okay, here, through the session, what it does? Obtains transaction object, right? And it will start the transaction. It will start the transaction. And after starting the transaction, what the transaction advisor will do? After starting, it will begin the transaction here. It will start the transaction. After that, what it does? It will call the which method? It will call which method? After starting the transaction. So transaction interceptor, first of all, will obtain the session. I'll tell you. Obtain session, first of all. And then, you see, through the session, obtains transaction object. And here we'll start the transaction. And after starting the transaction, what is the next thing it is supposed to do? Yes. What it is supposed to do? Come on, yeah, this is a very basic question. What it is supposed to do now? Yes. No. The transaction advice will execute the query, sir. Is it responsible for interacting with the database? This is, don't forget that this is transaction advice. Transaction advice. Yes. Come on. What it is supposed to do now? You know, this is transaction interceptor. It's a advice, right? So it is applying the advice before the method starts execution. Which method? It is applying the advice for which method? In our example, it is applying the advice to which method? It is applying the advice to which method? To the add product method. That means, what is this method known as? In terms of AOP, what is this method? It's basically a target method. So here, now tell me, so after starting the transaction, what the transaction interceptor or advice bean is supposed to do here? What it is supposed to do? Call the target method, right? Call the target method. Call the target method. The target method should be invoked. What is the target method in our example? It is add product. So now the target method is responsible for interacting with the database. Am I right? Target method is responsible for interacting with the database here. Okay? Yes. It is responsible for interacting with the database. So here you will find that now the target method will be interacting with the database, right? So target method also needs a session. This time the target method should use the session object. It is already created by the advice. It has to use the same session object which already is used by the advice. Advice being transaction interceptor has got a session object, right? Has got a session object. So here, this method, so this add product method, the target method is also supposed to use the same session object here. It has to use the same session object. Okay. So how the target object can obtain that session object which is already created by the session, which is already created by the advice. You see here, if the target method wants that session object which is already created by the session, which is already created by the, advice, right? The advice has already created it. Yes. So now, in order to obtain that object, okay, which is already created by the advice, see here, the target method has to use this get current session. Get current session means the session which is already created. Okay, so now here the target method has to use that current session which is already created, which is already obtained here by the advice. Okay, yes, because the target method here has to interact with the database, and you see the transactions are managed by the advice. So both the target method here and the advice bean have to use the same session object, okay, to make sure that the transaction advice is applied. Yes. Yeah. So both are dealing with the same transaction here. So they need a same session object. That is how it works. Fine. Is it clear for you people? What's the purpose of using get current session? Yes. Is it clear for you people? What is the purpose of using get current session? Okay. So hope this is clear for you people, right? So you see here, we're using the get current session. The target method is making sure that it obtains the session object which is already created the by the advice. Okay. Yes. It will obtain session which is already created by the advice here. That's it. So this is what we were missing here. Sorry. This was the issue. Okay. Now here, if you want to if you want to apply the advice or configure the advice details, if you want to configure the advice details using the annotations also, we can do that. It is possible. Okay. Now you see we are using XML, right? Instead of using XML, let's use the annotations here. Let's use the annotations instead of XML stuff. Fine. So for that, first of all, let's comment that code, okay, the XML code which we got. Then we will be able to make use of this code here. Yes. So all this code, these two lines. So if I want to enable the support for annotations, if I want to apply the advice using annotations, then what am I supposed to do here? Yes, I was referring to an element. What is that element? Yes. Yes. What is that element? Annotation driven. Okay. You have to configure the transaction manager details here. Hibernate transaction manager. That's it. You know what to do? Yes. So here you configure the advice using this emissions. Again you'll get the same message. Okay. This is how it works. Now this is the other way of configuring the advice details here. Okay. Yes. This is the other way of configuring the advice details. Fine. So let me run this form. So now we'll see whether the advice will be applied or not this time. Then add 108. Okay, we'll click on add. So this time we'll see whether the record is added or not. Yes, got the record. Okay, so this is the other way of applying the advice using annotations, configuring the advice details. We are configuring the advice details here. Yes. Okay. So any doubts or issues in this regard, please let me know. Okay. So for here, we'll talk about the transaction timeouts first. Transaction timeout. That is actually customizing the transaction behavior. What we can do is we can actually customize the transaction behavior here. You see the way we are handling the transactions. Yes. I'm sorry, not we. So we got the support right from the Spring framework itself for handling the transactions. You see here when you want to customize this default behavior. Okay, for suppose I want this method. I want this method to execute under the transaction context. But let's say here I want to make sure that the transaction executes within 5 milliseconds. Let's say within 10 milliseconds. So here I don't want the transaction to execute, or I don't want the transaction to take more than 10 milliseconds to execute. Okay, so if it takes more than 10 milliseconds, I want to terminate the transaction. Okay, don't want the transaction to spend much time here. Okay, so if the transaction doesn't execute within the specified period of time. So what do we mean by transaction first of all? Yes, what is it? What do we mean by transaction? Yes. Transaction means what is it? Yes, very good. A transaction is basically nothing but a set of DB operations. database operations. That's it. Just set of DB operations. Is there anything else? So transaction is basically set of DB operations which have to be executed, which has to be considered as a single unit of work. The set of DB operations should be considered as a single unit of work here. Okay, yes. So you will find that here as all the DB operations, set of DB operations should be considered as a single unit. They should be considered as a single unit of work. A transaction is nothing but we call it as a unit of work. Now here either all the DB operations in the transaction should execute or none of the DB operations in the transaction should execute. Okay, either all the DB operations should be executed or none of the DB operations should be executed here. Okay, yes. So you see, you'll find that here if the transaction executes partially, there will be serious issues. So that's the reason why whether we want to execute the transaction completely or the transaction should never execute. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So you see what I'm saying here? Said that set of DB operations. When I say transaction, yes, set of DB operations. They should execute in a specified or given period of time, let's say. And if those DB operations of the transaction, if it doesn't execute in time, okay, within the specified time, then I want the transaction to terminate. Okay, I want the transaction to terminate here abruptly in the middle of the execution itself. I want the transaction to terminate abruptly in the middle of the execution itself. Okay, yes. So what to do in that case? How can we make sure that we terminate the transaction in the middle of the execution? That means if the transaction doesn't execute within a specified period of time, I want to terminate the transaction. So this is a transaction behavior I want to configure. See, for that you can use timeout. Let's say 10. What does that mean? That means the transaction should execute in 10 milliseconds. What if the transaction doesn't execute in 10 milliseconds? Then it has to be terminated. The transaction has to be terminated. Yes. Yeah. So we don't need to write any code here to terminate the transaction. Explicitly it will be done. Okay. Okay. So now here let's move on. So this is customization here. And this is how we can customize. So next thing what we can do is we can configure the transaction propagation here. transaction propagation. So what is this transaction propagation? Yes. Here, transaction propagation is also very important. Transaction propagation is also very important here. Yes. You see, now I said the whenever you call the add product method, whenever this add product method is called, first of all, you know that the advice method will be invoked. Advice method is actually calling this method, which method? Add product. And you know what? Here, as of now, because we have configured the advice for this method, we want this method to execute under the transaction context. So you will find that here the advice being okay, to make sure that the transaction is enabled, right? And then it will call this add product method. So now this indicates that the transaction, this advice, the target method, because it is invoked under the transaction context, so this target method also executes under the same transaction. The target method which is invoked, it also executes under the same transaction here. Okay. Yes. After starting the transaction, so what happens? The advice method will call this method, right? Yes. So when this method is called from the transaction context, after calling the transaction, this method will be called. So that advice code is actually propagated to this method. Sorry, the transaction advice is propagated, is passed on to this method. I can say that this method also executes under the same transaction context. Okay, so that is what it indicates here. Propagation required means we want this method also to execute under the transaction context, okay, which is created by the advice. Yes. Now here the save method which is called from this method, the save method which is called here from this method, from the target method, it also executes under the same transaction context again. It also executes under the same transaction context again, okay, which was started by the advice. So that means here again I can say that the transaction has even propagate to that save method as well. The transaction will propagate to that save method as well. Yes. So yeah, the transaction is propagating. That means here the framework will make sure that this method always executes under the transaction context. Okay. Yes. So this method will be executing under the transaction context, which is created by the advice. So the advice is calling this method. The advice is calling this method, right? Which method? The target method. Advice, before it calls this target method, what it does, it will start the transaction, right? So after calling the transaction, from the transaction context itself, this method is called. From the transaction context itself, this method is called. So that means here, you know, we are making sure that this method also executes under the same transaction context. It means we want the transaction which is created by the advice to be used here, to be applied here for this method also. We want the transaction to be propagated. Okay, that means we want this method also to execute under the same transaction context, which is already created by the advice method. Okay, got it? So now here again from this method the advice is actually passed on to the save method, because save method is also invoked from the transaction context itself, because add product is executing under the transaction context, and now from the add product you are calling the save method. Save method also executes under the transaction context, same transaction context I can say. Okay, yes. Now you know what? Here, this way, transaction context is propagated from one method to the other method here. Okay, yes. What if that means propagation in sense, no, it won't physically come here. Okay, or there is nothing like that. But the only thing is, it indicates that this method also executes under the transaction context which was created by the advice. That's it. It is what it indicates. So whenever this method is called from the transaction advice, or sorry, transaction context, this method, whenever it is invoked from a transaction context, okay, yes. So always this method will execute under the transaction context. This method will be considered for the transaction context. Okay, this method will be considered for the transaction context here. Yes, fine. Now, you know what? What if I don't want the transaction to be propagated here? I don't want the transaction to be propagated here. So if I don't want the transaction to be propagated here, in that case, what I can do is I can actually um, stop the transaction propagation. We can use never. What does it mean? It means we don't want this method to be invoked from a transaction context. So this method should never execute, or the transaction should not propagate to this method. That means the transaction, this method should not execute under any transaction context. Okay? Yes. For this method execution, the transaction context should not be considered. For this method execution, the transaction context should not be considered. Yes. So what if this method is invoked from a transaction context? You see, what if this method is invoked from the transaction context? So if this method is invoked from the transaction context, in that case, you know, it is actually considered as an error. You'll get an error. Yes. You'll find that it will be an error itself straight away. Yes. Fine. Now, let me run this code and show you. So there will be an exception here in this case. Let's see. This exception. No, just a sec. Zero and 09. This time I'm trying to add one more record here. So, Click on add product. You'll find that here you'll get an exception. Yes, it says no session found for this method. Why so? Because you didn't want this method to execute under the transaction context. Right? You didn't want the method to execute under the transaction context. Yes. So that's the reason why we got this error. Yes. Okay. So hope you could do that. Okay. Basically, for not like though you got some DB operations, you may not need the transaction at all. But suppose for fetching the records, you don't need a transaction. Sometimes, okay, so let's say here you're fetching a particular record. Let's say in that case, you see just you're reading the records. And let's say that table, especially which you're dealing with, then it's a kind of master table. That means the records will be added to the table, but they will never be updated here. So it's all read-only operation, let's say. Always only when you're dealing with the table, you just read the records, but they're rarely updated, let's say. Very rare case. So in that case, you know what, here, instead of using, you don't need a session in that case, okay? Yes, you don't need a session in that case, and you can make sure that this method will never execute under the transaction context. Sorry, transaction context level. So that is the example. So I think we got some methods already here. You see, for example, here, the fetching a record. Just assume that this table, assume that the product table records are rarely updated. Don't need any transaction. So what you can do is here, you can update the record by using this open session. So now you get product. Product ID. So you won't get current session because for this method, I don't want the transaction to be low here. Okay, so I don't want the transaction here. So it's required, and when it comes to this method, I don't need any transaction. Yeah. So, is there any method which is the controller which can use such details? Let's see. I got product search controller. I'll make this controller use the PO qualifier product PO hit. Okay. V9 is product DOI. Yes. So the search controller will be using it. And in order to call the search controller, I think we got a JSP here for that. Yes, search JSP. So product search HTML. The forms action URL is set to product search HTML. Product search HTML. That's it. Okay. We'll use that search. No, not 4. We call search. Yep. We got the record. And down, yes, this is the select query is executed. It doesn't need any transactions here. Okay, fine. So, hope you people got it. Okay. So I'll stop it here today. And we'll meet tomorrow, okay, at our regular time itself. Please make sure that join the meeting as soon as possible, okay. So I'm going to stop it here, and we've got few more things to discuss regarding the transactions. I'll do